A very good morning to our honorable speaker, Chien Lee, and participants. With these new norms, we can still come together by using the online platform and to share experience and knowledge on science and biodiversity. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are about to begin, I would like to share some of the housekeeping notes. To avoid any interruption during the speaker's presentation, you may type your questions at the chat box. Your questions will be raised during the Q&A session. Before the end of the talk, kindly fill out a feedback form at the link provided. Ladies and gentlemen, we start our talk this morning. I would like to introduce our speaker, Chien Lee. Chien Lee is a biologist who turned as a photographer. He works in California as an environmental educator prior to moving to Borneo in 1996. Having discovered an incurable fascination with its equatorial rainforests, photography has been his profession since 2003. But he now spends an equal amount of time conducting wildlife tours across the tropics, with at least 9 months each year in the field. He is currently an honorary research fellow at the Institute of Biodiversity and Environmental Conservation at Universiti Malaysia Sarawak. Chien's primary focus for the past 2 decades has been documenting the rich diversity of the rainforests of Southeast Asia through photography, and in the process, he has succeeded in capturing the first ever images of many rare and endangered species in the region. He uses his photography as a tool to help convey an understanding and appreciation for nature for the people of these countries. To this end, he speaks regularly on the biodiversity of Borneo, including participating in outreach programs and public awareness campaigns. Chien has collaborated with several conservation organizations and research NGOs and has been invited to display his work at numerous photographic exhibitions in Malaysia. Without further ado, I would like to invite Chien Lee. The time is yours, Chien Lee.
Okay, thank you very much, Constance. Can you hear me? Just want to check my audio.
Yes.
Okay, and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Screen has been shared. Okay, great. Well, just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Really great to see such a wide interest in the topic that I'll be presenting. It's morning here on the northern coast of Borneo, but I know a lot of people are tuning in from overseas. So thank you for taking the time out of your day or your evening to join us. The topic of my talk today, of course, is discoveries and extinctions in the Borneo Rainforest and the race to find new species before they're lost forever. And if you're interested at all in the natural world, I'm sure this is a topic that you're familiar with. Some of us may have watched some recent documentaries. David Attenborough just recently put out a wonderful testament about global extinctions, and it's a very relevant topic today. So what I want to do is not repeat what Sir David has told us, but to give you a perspective as a photographer and a naturalist of some of the encounters that I've had over the past 25 years here in Borneo, some of the interesting new species that we've seen, and how this relates to what's happening around the planet. Now, before I get started, I want to thank Sarawak Biodiversity Centre again for giving me the opportunity to present here today. If you're tuning in from overseas and aren't familiar with the work that they do, they not only have contributed a lot to documenting the state's biodiversity, but also, very importantly, the indigenous knowledge about uses of local biodiversity. So if you haven't yet, please check out their website and media accounts, and you can find out some very interesting information there. One of the other things that SBC does is host outreach programs. Several times a year, they have an auditorium on their facilities that hosts members of the public to do public talks. And this is basically an extension of that. And it's really nice that despite the pandemic, that they've been able to reach out and make this available to people all around the world. So to say these last 12 months have been a difficult time, it's an understatement. I know a lot of us have basically had our lives on hold this past year. So really appreciative that we can still communicate in ways like this. One of the things to keep in mind is that all this time, even though many of us haven't been able to do much over the past year, is that the natural world, this is a very different case. Habitat loss, climate change, these are all things that are still continuing despite what we're doing. And you may have been witness to a lot of devastating things like fires in the Amazon and in other countries, which have been carried on despite the pandemic. And it's very frustrating. There's a lot of biological researchers who aren't able to get out and do field work this past year because of limits in travel. So it's been a time basically to sit back and work on your notes, write papers, etc. So that's partly how the subject for this talk came about. Now, the other reason is that discovery is just a fascinating thing. It's one of the things that really drives me to do the work that I do. Excuse me, I'm just trying to progress the slide here. How does it go forward?
Click on.
Okay. Before I do anything, I just want to give you an orientation to where we are in Borneo. This is the third largest island in the world, and it's covered with tropical rainforest. There are 3 countries on Borneo. Malaysia occupies the north and northwest coast. The large portion of the island is Indonesia. And then there's the small country of Brunei, sort of nestled inside one of the Malaysian states. And we're located here on the northwest coast in the city of Kuching. So I'm going to be mentioning some of the other neighboring islands like Sumatra, Java, but you can see that the mainland Southeast Asia is not that far away as well. So as I mentioned, Borneo is covered, or at least it used to be covered at one time, with tropical rainforest. Unlike some other tropical islands, which have very different climate regions across the island, Borneo is pretty consistent across the island. It's wet almost year-round and was once covered from coast to coast virtually with tropical rainforest. And if you're an enthusiast of nature and a photographer, Borneo is an amazing place to be. There is not only an incredible amount of biodiversity, but there are so many species out there that have never been photographed before or have been seldom seen. And every time you step into the rainforest, even if you've done this for decades, you have this sense of wonder that you don't know what you're going to encounter. You can come across something that is completely new any day of the year. So it's a very exciting place for that. Now, when I was a kid running around in California with my butterfly net and magnifying glass, the idea of finding a new species someday and even naming it, it seemed like a dream, like a fairy tale. And I think this is the same for a lot of people that have been interested in nature. It would be a wonderful thing to find something that no one has ever seen before. And that is actually taking place all the time in Borneo. Now, when we think about, one quote from E.O. Wilson is, "There is no better high than discovery." And this really sums up how thrilling it is to find something new. Now, when we think about the age of discovery, we often look back to the 19th century to some famous European explorers. One very relevant to the Borneo region is Alfred Russel Wallace, who spent many years exploring the Indonesian archipelago, including Borneo. And a lot of the things he found were completely new. Of course, he had many species that he described or were described in his honor. But this is not to say that the age of discovery is over. In fact, today we are discovering more species than ever before. Now, for people that aren't familiar with field biology, who don't spend their time out in the field working on new discoveries, your only exposure to new species may be newspaper clippings. Some species occasionally make headlines about new discoveries here and there. But actually, this is only the tip of the iceberg. Right now, biologists estimate that there's actually about 18,000 new species discovered every year globally. Now, of course, the great bulk of these is in tropical rainforests. Rainforests are believed to harbor about 2/3 of all terrestrial biodiversity, and yet they cover only 10% of land area. So it's an exceedingly rich ecosystem, and this is basically a frontier where a lot of these new discoveries are being made. And this begs the question, how many species actually are out there on the planet? And this proves to be a very difficult question to answer. We have really wide-ranging estimates. This depends a lot on how we define species, but the best estimates today are somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 million species. Recently, there have been some new predictions that estimate, if you include a lot of microorganisms and microbes, that this could be as many as 1 trillion species. So we have actually currently only described and named about 1.5 million species. So this means that we have a huge amount of work still left to do. Just going to take a look very quickly at some different groups of organisms. You can see vertebrates have about 65,000 species that have been named, and there's an estimated another 15,000 species that will probably still be described. Plants, also larger numbers, 310,000 described, and maybe another 80,000 more to be described, but still mostly described. But it's when we start looking at some of the more diverse organisms, particularly insects and other invertebrates, where we have about 1 million species that have been described, and potentially 5 million in total. So this shows how much work is remaining. And particularly if we start looking at groups like fungi and even microorganisms, these have an even smaller proportion of described species. Now, one advantage that we have now, even though this is an immense amount of work remaining, is that we have greater tools now to describe species and research biodiversity, better tools than ever before. These include better access to remote regions, better field equipment. We have excellent online resources. There's a lot of museums that share their specimens, great networking internationally for researchers to share their discoveries, and also tools that were previously very difficult to use. This is a new species of tiny toad that's found only on the summit of a single mountain in northern Borneo. It's only known from female specimens, and in fact, so rare that only a few have ever been found. But through DNA, been able to show that it is distinct. And DNA sequencing, now that it's become much more of an accessible tool, has become increasingly valuable for describing new species, and not only showing that they're distinct, but also showing their placement next to their closely related species. So very important tool nowadays. One of the things that DNA sequencing has enabled us to do is to reveal a lot of cryptic diversity or cryptic species. And by this, we mean species that were previously believed to comprise only a single species, but in fact can comprise many species. And this is because either we haven't had the tools or the time to distinguish them before. But now, when we have DNA and also just taking more time to scrutinize the differences between these organisms, we can find that there's actually many species where there was once believed to be only one. And as a great example is this group of frogs from Borneo. Not long ago, these were all considered to be a single species, Limnonectes coolii, which now is believed to be only from the island of Java to the south of Borneo. And when these frogs were looked at much more closely, we found that there's not only distinct morphological differences if you look closely, but also they're distinct genetically. Now, of course, when you look at photographs like this side by side, it's easy to see that they look quite differently. But it's important to remember that the differences you see here aren't actually comparable to what you may see in the field. For example, a lot of frog species may have a lot of individual variation. Look, for example, at the bottom two frogs on the right here. These are the same species, Limnonectes hickidae, and they show a great range of color variation. So morphological features like color can't be used reliably to define a species. Here's another cryptic species that recently was illuminated in Borneo. This is one of Borneo's famous flying frogs. We have 3 species of flying frogs in Borneo, and these are amphibians that have enormous webbed feet, and they're able to take a leap from trees and glide through the air, either landing on another tree or landing in the ground, sort of parachuting. And it's a big advantage living in the Borneo Rainforest to have this ability to glide. In fact, Borneo has more species of gliding creatures than anywhere else on the planet. This frog was once believed to be the same species as a similar one from Java and also from peninsular Malaysia, but recent research has shown that it's actually distinct from those. So it's been separated and given its own species status. Other cryptic species include snakes. This is a very unusual slug-eating snake, of which there are a number of species in Borneo. Also, a cryptic species that bears a lot of similarity to several other slug-eating snakes, but was recently, in fact, this is just published in 2020, was shown to be a distinct species. These are related to the famous snail-eating snakes, which some people might be familiar with, in that they have a very unusual dentition in their jaws, and they have an uneven number of teeth on their left and the right side of their jaws. And this enables them to specialize in feeding on snails by pulling them out of their shells because of this uneven number of teeth. We also have very small frogs that have been shown to be distinct recently. This is quite an interesting species because it lives entirely or breeds entirely within carnivorous pitcher plants. And here you can see an amplexing pair, male and female, that are about to lay eggs inside of this pitcher plant. If you look to the right of the frogs, this is a developing tadpole with legs here. And that's basically grown up inside the pitcher, and when it's turned into a small frog, will emerge out of the pitcher. Now, there's been a bit of taxonomic confusion about this species, actually. In 2010, it was originally described as Microhyla nepenthicola for its habit of living in Nepenthes pitcher plants. Several years later, that name was reduced to a synonym of Microhyla borneensis because of an ambiguous specimen that had been collected many, many years before, preserved in alcohol, that was believed to be the same as this species. Well, it was only last year that a new genetic study actually was able to show that this species is distinct from Microhyla borneensis, and therefore its name, nepenthicola, has been resurrected. Another interesting note on the side here, I just wanted to point this out. If you look above the tadpole here, you'll see this insect pupa. This is actually the pupa of a giant mosquito that we call Toxorhynchites. Some people refer to it as the elephant mosquito. And it's particularly interesting because rather than being a bloodsucker, it's a nectar feeder, in fact, the adult mosquitoes is, but the larvae are predators. And they are so voracious that they will not only prey on all the other mosquito larvae that happen to be in a pitcher plant, but they will also prey on the tadpoles of this frog. So here we have the tables being completely turned. We have a mosquito eating a frog in a plant that's actually eating insects. Even the largest land carnivore in Borneo, the clouded leopard, is recently been shown to be a cryptic species. Previously, clouded leopards were thought to comprise a single species ranging throughout mainland Asia through Sumatra and Borneo. But recent studies have shown that it's actually distinct, and now the Bornean clouded leopard has been given its own taxonomic status. And other mammals as well. The slow lorises of Borneo were once thought to be a single species. Now it's believed to comprise 4 separate species. Now this is a study that was done actually rather than on DNA, it was based on differences in the coloration and the pelt of these animals. So this is a study that actually would benefit greatly from having DNA research to back it up in the future. But it's very interesting that so much diversity is being found where previously there was only thought to be a single species. Now, this isn't to say that all the new species being found today are similar to something that was previously known, because more than infrequently, we actually come across organisms that are completely different from everything that we know, such as this blue-legged tarantula, which we photographed a few years ago in Borneo. It turned out to be not only a new species, but actually an entirely new genus. And when you come across something like this, which was a complete surprise to finding this at night in the forest, not only had I never seen it before, but it was such an amazing appearance that immediately we knew it was something special. There are also a lot of other invertebrates, including stick insects. Borneo is home to over 360 species now, and new ones are being found every year. This is a species that has several clever adaptations. It's not only disguised as lichen, but when it's disturbed, it has the ability to raise its wings in these alarming warning colors to deter predators. Plants as well. One of the more remarkable genera of plants that are being worked on now are these that are called fairy lanterns. This is in the genus Thismia. And these are very tiny plants that live in the forest leaf litter, and they have no chlorophyll of their own. These are what we call mycoheterotrophic plants, and they rely on associations with fungi to actually obtain their nutrients rather than getting it from chlorophyll. They're very tiny plants, very easy to overlook on the forest floor, and it's easy to see how many have been overlooked, and they're discovering new species now. This is one that was just described last year. Insects as well. This is a discovery published just a couple years ago. This is a species of ant called exploding ants, or even kamikaze ants. And they have the ability to, when defending their colony, they can actually mix a cocktail of chemicals in their abdomen and rupture in an explosive manner that spreads all this orange liquid over an invading ant from another colony or any species that's attacking them. So they sacrifice their lives to defend their colony, but this chemical explosion is actually their #1 defense. Now, plenty of new frogs are being found in Borneo. This is a tiny species of tree frog, just discovered 6 years ago in Borneo. It was so surprising that the people who named it gave it the species name inexpectata, which means they had no idea they were going to find anything like this. At the time, it was believed to be an entirely new genus for Borneo, but recent genetic studies have placed it in the genus Phaehyla, which is related to one other known Bornean frog. And very interestingly, we do have records of new vertebrates as well, including a new species of bird. Now, there are actually many new species of bird that have been discovered in Borneo, but these are largely species that have been related to other species. A lot of, as we say, cryptic taxa or splits from other known bird species from either mainland Southeast Asia or elsewhere. But it's very unusual indeed to find something that is so completely different that it's not related to anything very closely. It's not a split, in other words. And that's what this bird represents. This is called the spectacled flowerpecker. And it's actually the first completely new bird species found in Borneo in over 100 years. And it's interesting about how a species like this can go undetected for so long. One of the reasons is probably that this bird, although it was first observed over a decade ago, it seems to be restricted to the upper canopy of the rainforest, and very small, very difficult to observe, and also quite rare. So observations were very, very scarce for this species. And it seems to be perhaps also even nomadic in its habits. Even though it was observed in a single area, it may not appear in that area again for years. One of the specialties of this bird and other flower peckers related to it is that they feed on the tiny fruits of mistletoes. I think I have a shot here, one feeding on a mistletoe berry here. And this is actually a crucial way for the plant to disperse. They've evolved together with this bird. The bird swallows the seeds and excretes the seeds onto branches in the upper canopy of the rainforest trees, and that's where the mistletoe colonizes a new spot. Okay. And there are also plenty of species that have been found recently that still have no names at all. This is a tiny spider I photographed a few years ago in eastern Borneo. It's one of a group of spiders that mimic ladybug beetles. Ladybugs, of course, have toxic blood, and they're poisonous for many animals to ingest. And this spider, not having any other particular defenses, mimics a beetle to take advantage of that defense. Other species of stick insects, most stick insects are known for being extremely camouflaged, but of course, some species have a completely different method of defense. This is a stick insect that advertises itself with bright colors, probably because it's toxic or has a noxious compound to defend itself. There are new species of frogs. This is another frog that also lives inside of pitcher plants. My colleagues and I are currently working on diagnosing this species. Plants as well. This is a species of tiny orchid, very unusual flowers that are less than a centimeter across each, but they have such an unusual shape, it's possible that they even mimic insects to attract pollinators. As of yet, this species still has no name. Spiders as well. Now, sometimes we encounter new species merely as a fortuitous encounter. Other times, a lot of new species can be found by reviewing specimens in museums and collections. It might not be from your own collection. It may be from something that was collected years ago, decades ago, or even centuries ago that turn out to be species that had never been given attention before. But oftentimes, discovering new species actually requires a lot of fieldwork. And I just wanted to give you an example here of a friend of mine, Dr. Wayne Madison from University of British Columbia, who specializes in jumping spiders. And as an example of what fieldwork can uncover, his team came to Borneo a number of years ago, and at the time, there were only 60 species of jumping spiders known from the state of Sarawak. Well, after just several weeks of collecting in the field, they found over 300 species of jumping spiders. Now, of course, not all those are new species, but quite a few of them are. And it shows that how even just a little bit of field work in an area that's as understudied as Borneo can yield many interesting finds. Now, you don't also have to go to remote rainforest areas, have huge expeditions to uncover new species. You can actually find new species in unlikely places. This is a species of skink that was recently described from basically a city park in an urban area where we live on the north coast of Borneo, Subduloceps samajaya. I think I have a picture showing this small urban jungle park located in an urban area. So it's just something that had been completely overlooked before. And when we give attention to these species, it's not unusual to find something that nobody has recognized before. Now, just to give you an idea of what's involved with describing a new species, this is a pitcher plant that I found almost 2 decades ago. It's actually the first new species I described, and it was a very exciting find for me at the time, but it illustrates the process that you usually have to go through when you're describing a new species. So when I first found this plant, and I recognized it as something that was very unusual, I had to obtain collecting permits. And this is because when you describe a new species, you need a voucher specimen. And after obtaining the permits to collect a herbarium specimen, this needs to be deposited in a herbarium that is publicly accessible. This herbarium sheet will ultimately become the type specimen that refers to this species. And people who are studying it can refer to it many years in the future. And then the next part of the problem is to go and write up a diagnosis of the species. You have to not only compare it to all the other potential related species, but provide a detailed description that really helps to define the species. And then once you've done this, it needs to be submitted to a scientific journal where it's peer reviewed. And if it's accepted, the species name becomes valid. Now, of course, biologists make mistakes, and it could be that some of the species that you thought were new once may turn out to be the same species as something that was already described. And in those instances, the name gets reduced to a synonym. But if you've done your work diligently, the species name will stand forever. Of course, you do not have to be a PhD botanist to publish a new species of plant. Technically, anybody can actually go through this process, but you do need to be able to do all the work to prove that it's actually new. Now, although some species do not have specimens, people have been finding other ways to describe them as new species. This is a beautiful leaf katydid found in Borneo that was recently published, not based on a specimen in a museum, but based on photographs. And sometimes specimens may not be available, or in certain instances, the new species being described may be so critically endangered that the biologists who are working on it don't want to collect one of the last remaining specimens, because it could put the species at risk. And in these cases, it's possible that using photography and even DNA can suffice to describe a new species as a voucher instead of actually collecting a specimen. So why go through all the trouble of describing new species? Well, it's a lot of work, as we've seen, but this is actually fundamental. It's very important that we describe new species, because without this, we won't be able to actually understand the planet's ecosystems. We need to know this because we need to identify areas that are going to be the focus for conservation. We can't actually protect what's there until we know what's there and the extent of the biodiversity. So it's very fundamental that we know what we're dealing with. It's also important because on an individual species basis, we can't actually assess the conservation risk of an organism unless it has a taxonomic identity. So there are many species that need to be described so that we can actually give them a reasonable assessment and target them for conservation. Also, a big issue is that many species, even those that have already been described, have not been assessed. This is another hurdle that people have to tackle. I think it's as few as 1% of species that have been described have been properly assessed for conservation. But also, in addition to that, we have to take into account that globally, we are facing mass extinctions now. And so the time is now more urgent than ever before to actually document biodiversity on this planet. Now, habitat loss is something that is not just taking place in Borneo. We see global habitat loss of all types, particularly tropical rainforests, which harbor so much biodiversity. And this is a huge problem right now. It's pushing many species to the brink. This is also, this is in Borneo, but here you can see very similar phenomena taking place in other continents. This is forests being burned in Madagascar. So it's very clear that with habitat loss, many species are going to be pushed over the edge. Just take a very quick look at forest loss in Borneo over the past 70 years. You can see that in the mid 20th century that it was actually probably possible for a squirrel to cross from one end of Borneo to the other without ever leaving a tree. And sadly, that's no longer the case. Even in just the past 20 years, forest in Borneo has become increasingly fragmented and reduced. And although we do still have a lot of forest in the interior, it is reducing at an even faster rate these days. And so this has resulted in many, many species being pushed to the edge and extinction as well on a global scale. Now, when we think of mass extinction events, a lot of people conjure up images of meteor impacts on the Earth and cataclysmic events that wipe out 90% of the species overnight. But in fact, mass extinctions don't necessarily mean something that happens so quickly. The Earth has had 5 recognized mass extinctions in the past. The most famous, of course, is the meteor impact that wiped out the dinosaurs 60-odd million years ago. But there's been many other instances of extinctions before that. Extinctions or mass extinctions actually can take thousands of years to happen. And what's important to recognize is that these events occur where the extinction rate is exceeding the normal background extinction rate. Just pull up these. Okay, Of course, everybody's familiar with the dodo and perhaps the golden toad as examples of extinct species. Well, if we look at the fossil record, of course, we realize that the large extent of life on our planet, more than 99% of all species that have ever existed, have gone extinct. But normally this occurs at a very slow rate. Biologists estimate about one species every 500 to 1,000 years. But if we look at the past 500 years, there's been nearly 1,000 species actually that have gone extinct. And this is largely due to the activities of people. So what we're looking at right now, and again, estimates on this vary a lot, but we can document about 100 species going extinct every year. Now that's a conservative estimate. Actually, when biologists look at the amount of habitat destruction and the potential for species that we don't know about actually disappearing, it's much larger than that. Some people estimate there can be as many as 20,000 species disappearing every year. Now, when we look at Borneo, it's actually very difficult to document extinctions. A lot of the rainforest on the island is very dense, improperly explored, and to a large part, many species that occur here, we don't really understand the full extent of their distribution. And so this makes it very difficult to know when something has gone extinct. Of course, it's much easier to show that something is actually alive than it's gone. And so for this reason, we actually don't have solid evidence of any species in Borneo going extinct in the last 50 to 100 years. That's not to say that many species are under threat. Now, case in point, many species that have been, say, lost or disappeared in the forests of Borneo have actually turned up alive and well. And this is because of the increasing number of people doing field research in Borneo. One of the great examples is this species here called the Borneo rainbow toad, which was actually missing for almost 90 years until it was recently rediscovered in rainforest in Western Borneo. And this is not to say that, well, we don't actually know how rare this species is, but it's possible that this species could actually turn up elsewhere as fieldwork increases. But it does give us hope that other species that have been missing may turn up. There's even plants as well. This is one of Borneo's more interesting endemic pitcher plants. It grows only high on limestone cliffs, as you can see here, several hundred meters above the rainforest canopy on limestone cliffs. It grows nowhere else. Originally, this species was known from only a single limestone outcrop in eastern Borneo. And when that area burned down due to a forest fire, it was subsequently believed to be extinct. And it wasn't until, I think it was about 15, 20 years later, that we actually found this alive and well on limestone cliffs on the other side of Borneo in Sarawak. So more explorations like this, including in difficult to reach areas, may yield species that were believed to be gone. There are also tiny plants like the Thismia I mentioned earlier. This is another species of the mycoheterotrophic plant, very small, just a few inches in height, that grows on the forest floor and very easy to overlook. This is a species that had not been seen in over 150 years, and only 2 years ago was discovered alive and well in the rainforest, not far from where we live in Kuching. So these discoveries do give us some hope that missing species can turn up. Nevertheless, we do have a lot of species in Borneo that undoubtedly are on the brink of extinction. And we're able to study these. Perhaps they're large and more easily observable species. And we know that there's just a few remaining individuals left. The most classic example is the Bornean rhinoceros, of which the last known individual died in captivity just a few years ago. There are a few rumors of a few rhinoceros remaining in other parts of Borneo, but it's very clear that this is a species that is really on the brink and quite likely, without any dramatic help, will be extinct in the next few years. It's an example of a species that's not only suffered from habitat fragmentation, but also by poaching by humans. Primates as well. A lot of people may be familiar with the orangutan, which is a critically endangered species in Borneo, but there are other primates as well that are even rarer than the orangutan. This is called the Sarawak langur. It's only known from a few scattered populations in the northwestern part of Borneo. This is the black morph found in the very western tip of Borneo. And it's possible that there may be as little as 200 or slightly more individuals left remaining. So it's a very critically endangered species. The pangolin, the most trafficked mammal in the wildlife trade today, not just because of its meat, but because of the scales. They're used in traditional medicine. And this is an animal that has been wiped out because of hunting over large areas of Southeast Asia, and now increasingly so in Borneo. They're becoming very, very rare and very hard to see in the wild now. Of course, these are animals that feed on termites and ants in the rainforest. They're very important for the rainforest ecology. And when they're gone, it will have serious impact on the ecology of the rainforest. Hornbills as well. Of the 8 species that we have in Borneo, the most critically endangered and the rarest by far is the helmeted hornbill. There have been several good documentaries done on this species recently and the threats that it's facing. This is the only hornbill that actually has a solid casque on top of the bill, and it's used as ivory for a trade, and it's very valuable. It fetches a lot of money, and consequently, poachers comb the forest over large parts of Borneo to hunt for this species to sell for this trade. Some plants as well are very critically endangered. This is a species of pitcher plant, probably one of the rarest of all pitcher plants, certainly the rarest in Borneo, Nepenthes clypeata. It's actually known from only a single rock outcrop in Borneo and is found nowhere else. And not only has this single location suffered greatly from forest fires, it's burned several times and wiped out the majority of plants that way, but also these plants have been mercilessly collected for the black market trade as an ornamental plant. And I once witnessed in towns near this area where this plant grows, these plants being sold by the kilo. And now there are very, very few left in the natural habitat. So it's certainly on the brink of being wiped out completely. Frogs as well. Now, as many people might be aware, amphibians are the most threatened group of animals on the planet. They've suffered in many places, not just because of habitat loss, but also because of a virulent infection called chytrid fungus, which particularly has wiped out a lot of amphibian populations in the New World in North and Central and South America, such as the golden toad I showed earlier. Now, interestingly, we have not yet had many incidents of chytrid fungus infections in Borneo, and biologists don't actually know the reason for this. It could be because the temperatures here are different for what this fungus actually thrives in, or it could be that the frogs in this area may have some degree of resistance. But fortunately, so far, amphibian populations in Borneo have largely been spared from this pathogen that's wiped out so many other frog populations. But that's not to say that Borneo amphibians are not without their threats. This is a recently described tiny species of toad. It's so small that it fit very comfortably on the top of your thumbnail. It's known only from a tiny mountaintop in northern Borneo. Pull up the picture right here. Very small area on the top of this mountain, scarcely more than the size of a few football fields. And this is a classic example of what can happen to a species if climate change continues. Now, if climate change progresses and vegetation zones of mountains are pushed upwards as the climate warms, a lot of species are expected to follow this by moving higher up in the mountains. But when you have a species like this toad that already lives only on the summit of this mountain, there's nowhere else to go. So if those vegetation zones are pushed higher up, this is one of the first species that may be affected and could consequently become extinct. Another very interesting amphibian that's heavily threatened is this one, known from central Borneo. This is actually the only frog in the world that has no lungs. It's called the Bornean lungless frog. And it has a very interesting adaptation. It's completely aquatic. As you can see, it has a very flat profile to its body. And it's believed that the reason it lives in clear, fast-flowing, cool streams is because it needs to absorb dissolved oxygen in the water in order to survive, hence having no lungs. So any disturbance to the water there, such as gold mining and other activities such as logging in those areas, which add a lot of sediment to the water, directly affect this species, and it's shown to be wiped out in a lot of areas it was once thought to occur. So what are we going to do about all of this? Well, it's very clear that on a global scale, we need to have a major change in how we look at land usage and the usage of natural resources. And this is something that fundamentally needs to be done across the planet in order to conserve biodiversity. Of course, one of the big challenges that conservationists are facing now is coming to the realization that we can't save everything. There's a very important task right now, which is to identify areas which should be targets for conservation. If you only have, for example, 500,000 hectares of forest that you're allowed to preserve in a particular region, how can you maximize biodiversity by picking the areas that will conserve the most number of species and prevent them from becoming extinct? Now, I want to talk a little bit, of course, about the role of describing new species. So we still need to continue documenting new species. This is fundamental to being able to conserve the biodiversity as well. But it is a long process, and we have many new species out there to document. I just wanted to draw an example of another pitcher plant species that my colleagues and I just described last year. From the time that this species was first photographed to when it was finally published spanned nearly, it's over 15 years, in fact. It took us several years working on the paper, getting all access to the herbarium specimens, and having the paper accepted. So this is a long process. And if you look at the potentially more than 10 million species that still need to be documented, this is something that could take us hundreds of years to do if we deal with every species on a similar fashion. So biologists have recently been turning to other methods for describing species in a more rapid way. And this has been coined turbo taxonomy. A friend of mine, Alex Riedel, who specializes in weevils, has come across so many new species in this single genus of weevils. In fact, he has scientific papers coming out where they describe as many as 100 species in a single paper. And obviously, it's impossible to deal with each species in as much detail as we did when describing a new species of pitcher plant. And so this is where this term turbo taxonomy comes to play. A lot of these species can now be DNA barcoded, and we have access to using tools such as high definition digital photography to photograph all the relevant morphological features of each specimen, and then draft up a very quick description of the species. And in that fashion, it's much easier to go through species in a more rapid way. And this is what's necessary to progress through the many species that are still remaining to be described. Now, there's also a way for non-biologists to be involved. Citizen science is actually a very important tool for us to share our observations. One of the platforms that I use is iNaturalist, and increasingly a lot of people are becoming more familiar with this. It's a great way to share observations that you've made anywhere in the world. And if you take a photo of some interesting organism and don't share it, you're missing the opportunity of adding this to a pool of observations that can be used potentially by research who are studying such organisms, and occasionally can come across something new or important because it represents a record that's unknown for that area. So I would encourage anybody that does take photographs or observations in nature to find a medium to share them online, such as this. The other thing to think about when discovering new species is how important they are with actually promoting conservation. Now, everybody is fascinated by new species that are being discovered, and it's a way to garner public attention, to push conservation incentives for particular areas. There's even some more novel ways to promote conservation through the discovery of new species. My colleagues in Ecuador, a few years ago, published a paper where they described several new species of snail-eating and slug-eating snakes. And these species were given names based on donations. So they opened an auction through Rainforest Trust, where people could actually contribute a large sum of money to choose the name that would be given for this species. And that money went directly back into conservation, to preserving the areas where these snakes were found in. So it's a great example how new discoveries can actually promote and help conservation directly. I want to close now with a quote from David Attenborough that he mentioned: "We are now at a unique stage in our history. Never before have we had such an awareness of what we are doing to the planet, and never before have we had the power to do something about that." And this is very relevant to what we're facing today. The planet is undoubtedly in a current mass extinction, and this is the first time that it's being caused not only by a single species, but by a single species that has the power to change that. And I want to encourage everybody that spends time in nature to get out and continue their explorations, to remember that we live in a planet that is still largely unexplored in terms of biodiversity. There's so many new things to document out there, and to please get out there and help us understand more about our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chien, for that interesting information. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will read the question through and appreciate Chien Lee to provide his feedback. So the first question is from David McLoda. Can the various clouded leopards and lorises interbreed to create hybrids?
Sorry, the question, various clouded leopard species and slow lorises breed to make hybrids?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, yeah, what you're getting at is if we define a species by its reproductive feasibility, whether or not these two species can actually interbreed. And that brings up the question of how we define a species. To answer that directly, I don't know if that's ever been tested, whether these different slow lorises or different clouded leopards can actually form viable offspring. But the species definition in this respect has to be somewhat flexible. We do have evidence, of course, of many organisms, such as plants, for example, that do make viable hybrids, interspecies hybrids, even intergeneric hybrids that are viable, and yet they undoubtedly represent distinct species.
Our second question will be, is the chemical from the exploding ant toxic?
Good question. I don't know exactly. I presume it to be. It's either toxic or it's noxious enough to repel predators. If I'm not mistaken, I have read accounts of other ants being killed by it. So perhaps it is toxic to some level. Whether or not it's toxic to everything or just toxic to other invertebrates, I don't actually know the answer to that. I bet that could be found online by the paper that described that.
So the third one will be, was that stick insect named after you? From Francisca, as she noticed that the species name was Chien Lee.
Very good observation. Yes, it was named after me. It was a species that I helped to find the specimen for that.
Okay, will be from Val Measurement. Is the matang narrow mouth frog still known as Macrola boinensis? Is it restricted to the niche of matang? How can non-scientists keep up with changing names?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so the first part of the question was Microhyla borneensis and Microhyla nepenthicola. So as of last year, this new research paper that was just released, which had a very detailed phylogeny of these Microhyla frogs, it's been shown that the frogs that we found in Matang, that until recently we were called Microhyla borneensis, are now resurrected to become Microhyla nepenthicola. So now they're no longer the same thing. Microhyla borneensis is now known from a different locality. And Val, I can share that information with you later offline. But as to the extent of the range of that species, we have actually observed these tiny frogs living in pitcher plants in the genus Microhyla at quite a number of locations around Borneo, including as far north as Mulu National Park. And the work has not been done yet to show whether those actually represent the same species as the ones found in Matang or not. So they could well represent yet more new species, and we don't yet know the answer to that. The last part of the question, I'm sorry, what was that again?
How can non-scientists keep up with changing names?
Oh, yes, yeah, very good question. It's not easy. There are a lot of online databases for certain taxa like stick insects and grasshoppers and such, and those tend to keep up to date. There's great references for reptiles, for amphibians that generally keep very up to date on name changes. But to answer your question, really, to be able to follow all the name changes, you have to check these databases. Otherwise, it's very easy to miss new publications.
Okay, our next question is, how has the progress in technology helped in finding new species in Borneo? Any examples from you? Or can share?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the methods that I mentioned, particularly the ease of DNA sequencing, has helped a lot with finding new species in Borneo, such as the frogs I just mentioned. And you know, it wasn't long ago, 15, 20 years ago, that sequencing was a very difficult tool to use. And it's become so rapid now that biologists can use it almost, not long now, actually use it in the field to sequence species. So that's one of the most important technological advances that help with finding new species, for sure. There's even other methods as well. Even the increasing use of digital photography and the increasing resolution of digital cameras has helped a lot with the description of new species. There are, for example, some colleagues of mine work on describing tadpoles of frogs in Borneo, which are very difficult to diagnose properly because when you preserve a specimen in alcohol, which is necessary to keep a voucher, it tends to lose a lot of these subtle colors and other fine details that it would have in life. And actually, taking extremely detailed digital photographs of these tadpoles can show a lot of details that wouldn't otherwise be viewable when looking over a dead specimen. And that's become a very important tool for describing those differences.
We have one last question. In your career, what is your most memorable species encounter? And what is your favorite species group? It's from Amira Akila.
That's probably one of the most difficult questions of all. I'd say it's very, very hard to pick something that's the most memorable encounter, but I am fascinated by so many things. One of the great things about photography is it allows you to pursue many, many different groups of organisms. I have to say I'm equally fascinated by plants as I am with birds and insects. Some types of organisms that particularly fascinate me are those that have ways of deceiving us, such as camouflage and mimicry. And those are some of the adaptations that I find particularly interesting and memorable.
All right. Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, before we end, we will have a feedback form at the link there provided after the end of the session. So we would like all of you to fill in the feedback form. And on behalf of SBC, I would like to thank Chien Lee for this wonderful sharing on his discovery. And thank you also to all the participants for your active participations. And for those who are asking on where to get our recorded live of our webinar today, you can always like our Facebook page, SBC official Facebook page, which you can see on this screen, https://www.facebook.sarawak/Sarawak Biodiversity Centre. And I would also like to take this opportunity to inform that our next online public talk entitled Philatelic Biodiversity, Frogs on STEM by Prof. Dr. Indranil Des will be held on the 28th January, which is on Thursday, next week at 10 a.m. as well. So hope to see you all again in our upcoming online event. And for those questions that we didn't get to answer it, we will email to you all the answers, and we will get Chien Lee as well to help us up on certain questions that you ask personally. Yeah. So with this, thank you everyone, and have a nice day. Thanks, Chien Lee.
Thank you very much.